Have you ever wondered how the most vulnerable women in medieval society, the women of brothels, managed to survive the deadliest winters in European history? Picture this: snow piling up against the windows of timber houses, blocking out the little daylight that filtered through the gray sky. Temperatures so bitter that rivers froze from bank to bank, halting trade and food deliveries. Even wine, poured into heavy goblets in castle halls, froze solid before anyone could drink it. For the nobility, survival meant buying vast amounts of firewood, wool, and salted meat. But what about those who had no wealth, no family protection, and no place in respectable society? Women working in brothels stood at the very bottom of the social order. They were condemned by the church, despised by the wealthy, and forgotten by officials. And yet, against all odds, they found ways not only to endure, but sometimes to thrive, when nobles themselves were rationing bread and fuel. What you're about to hear is one of history's most overlooked survival stories. These women developed strategies so advanced that historians now recognize them as early examples of social innovation, resilience, and resource management. Let's step into their world and discover the remarkable ways they outwitted winter's grip. Before we look at their survival methods, you need to understand just how brutal these winters were. The winter of 1315 marked the beginning of the Great Famine. Crops failed, rivers froze, livestock starved, and ordinary people boiled tree bark just to eat. In 1348, winter brought not only deadly cold but also the plague. Towns became frozen graveyards where the sound of bells tolling for the dead never stopped. By 1709, during what historians call the Great Frost, temperatures were so severe that the River Thames in London froze solid enough for people to drag carts across it. Entire orchards died, and even nobles wrote in their diaries of hunger and misery. Now imagine being a woman with no wealth, no husband to provide, and no legal protection, living in the poorest quarter of town. How could such women survive? The answer lies in 10 extraordinary strategies. While nobles built private fires in each chamber, brothel women learned that survival meant sharing. They pooled their resources to buy cheap, fast-burning fuel and rotated heating between rooms. When the fire died out, they turned to one another. 3 or 4 women slept in the same bed, not just for comfort, but because body heat could keep them alive through nights that dipped far below freezing. Food was also part of their heating system. Instead of eating cold bread like nobles, they made hot spiced wines, broths, and stews that stoked body warmth from within. By trading services for kitchen access in taverns or manors, they transformed scraps into life-saving meals. Warm wool garments were luxuries far beyond their reach. So these women created a clothing library. One woman's cloak might pass through 5 sets of shoulders in a single week, rotating to whoever needed it most, those working outside, the sick, or the elderly. They also mastered layering. Instead of relying on one thick fur, they wore multiple thin fabrics, creating insulating air pockets. Feet wrapped in layers of cloth scrap stayed warmer than the leather boots worn by merchants. Even their work dresses were secretly altered. Thin batting was sewn into linings for invisible insulation, and warming oils or perfumes were applied to the skin, creating an illusion of warmth for both survival and seduction. Brothels were often drafty, poorly built houses in the worst neighborhoods. But these women became engineers of survival. Heavy curtains divided large halls into smaller, heat-trapping spaces. Furniture was rearranged to redirect warmth from cooking fires. Hollow reeds carried heat from kitchens into sleeping areas, primitive ventilation systems centuries ahead of their time. In summer, they prepared for winter, blocking windows, lining walls with straw, even digging cellars under the floors where the earth itself provided insulation. Respectable society refused to help them, so they built alliances across unexpected boundaries. Blacksmiths shared the heat of their forges. Stable boys let them shelter among animals for warmth. Even monastery kitchens quietly provided food or hot space in exchange for favors the priests would never admit in public. They also connected with other marginalized groups, foreign laborers, traveling merchants, and sometimes criminals, creating webs of support that crossed class lines and defied the rigid hierarchy of medieval towns. While nobles relied on expensive imports like dried figs or salted beef, brothel women became experts at preserving scraps. They fermented vegetables to keep them edible for months, brewed warming drinks from spoiled fruits, and smoked cheap cuts of meat until they lasted through winter. But their true innovation was communal cooking. Instead of each woman fending for herself, they rotated duties, one cooking for all on Monday, another on Tuesday, spreading the burden and ensuring everyone ate warm meals together. Knowledge was as valuable as gold. These women knew which merchants carried firewood, which households were discarding old clothes, and which city officials could be bribed for protection. They formed intelligence networks across entire regions, sharing news about weather, prices, and opportunities. In a sense, they became the first information traders, passing along survival secrets and spreading innovations faster than any noble household could. Unlike peasants tied to their fields, these women could move. They mapped their towns by warmth, knowing which alleys trapped sunlight, which districts stayed warmer from nearby workshops, and which cellars held heat longest. When cold peaked, entire groups relocated temporarily, occupying warmer microclimates until conditions improved. Their mobility gave them an edge that static households lacked. Doctors were expensive, and medieval medicine was often dangerous. So they built their own systems. They recognized frostbite and hypothermia early, treating them with warming oils and herbal remedies. They boiled herbs to ease coughs and infections. They practiced hygiene rituals that lowered disease risk at a time when nobles barely washed. This preventive care not only kept them alive but also made them valuable healers for clients and neighbors, creating both income and protection. They studied markets. When firewood was cheap in summer, they pooled coins to buy in bulk. They dried herbs and stored grain in community stockpiles. When shortages came, they had options, and sometimes even profited by trading surplus. Their portfolio of resources was diversified, with backups ready if one fuel or food source failed. It was a form of economic resilience centuries before economists gave it a name. Being outsiders gave them freedom. Respectable merchants could not risk dealing with smugglers, but brothel women had no such restrictions. They tapped into black markets and alternative supply chains, securing goods others could not. Even local authorities, who normally harassed them, often looked the other way during winter because brothel districts remained strangely stable. While other poor areas rioted for bread, these women's networks kept desperation in check. The results shocked officials. Court records show brothel districts sometimes generated more revenue in winter than in summer. Priests' confessions reveal these women fed orphans, supported unemployed craftsmen, and even aided destitute families outside their own community. Most astonishing of all, nobles began secretly copying them. Lords paid for their food preservation methods. Merchants hired them as survival consultants. Knowledge flowed upward, shaking the rigid order of medieval life. History often painted these women as immoral outcasts. Yet in reality, they were innovators, pioneers of communal survival, resource management, preventive health, and economic resilience. In the bitterest winters, it wasn't noble wealth or church authority that proved most effective. It was the wit, courage, and cooperation of the women society tried to forget. Their story is a reminder that survival doesn't always belong to the powerful. Sometimes, it belongs to those who have nothing but each other. But winter was merciless. As the weeks dragged on, hunger became an even bigger enemy than the cold. Bread was scarce, and meat was often spoiled before it reached the town. Brothel women had to rely on scraps left over from taverns, bones thrown by butchers, or whatever stew they could stretch with roots and dried beans. Many of them learned to cook with almost nothing, turning bitter herbs and frozen turnips into thin soups just to keep themselves alive. Some of the luckier brothels made deals with merchants and hunters. A pelt here, a cut of venison there, traded not for coins but for favors. For women who had little control over their own lives, survival often came at the cost of sacrifice. Still, they endured, creating silent networks of trade and barter just to make it through the season. Inside the dim wooden chambers, survival was just as much about warmth as it was about food. Layers of old straw and wool were laid under the beds. Furs, sometimes stolen, sometimes gifted, were shared between 2 or 3 women at once. They huddled together, knowing that body heat could mean the difference between waking up alive or never waking at all. But winter also brought danger. Frozen streets meant fewer customers. With no steady flow of coins, brothel keepers grew desperate and cruel. Some locked the doors, forcing the women to work longer hours when clients finally came. Others cut rations of bread and ale, hoarding whatever supplies they had for themselves. Survival in those times was not just about enduring the cold, but also enduring the cruelty of men who saw them as nothing more than property. And yet, amid all this hardship, these women built their own forms of strength. Some crafted small charms from iron nails, straw dolls, or scraps of fabric, whispering old prayers believed to protect against frostbite and illness. Others shared stories at night, tales of warmer lands, of summers past, or of men who once loved them. These stories were not just entertainment, they were a way to keep hope alive in a world that seemed determined to freeze it out. As the harsh medieval winters deepened, illness spread like wildfire. The cold seeped into their bones, weakening bodies already fragile from hunger and exhaustion. Fevers rose, coughs rattled through the cramped brothel chambers, and frostbite turned fingers and toes black. There were no doctors willing to step inside these places. The women had to become healers for one another, using whatever knowledge they had, herbal teas brewed from dried nettle, poultices made of garlic and onion, even warm stones pressed to the chest to fight the chill. Death, however, was a constant companion. When a woman passed away in the night, there was rarely a proper burial. Other times, her absence was simply covered up by the brothel keepers, who feared losing customers if the truth spread. For the survivors, grief had to remain silent. They mourned not with tears, but with the act of surviving another day. The winters also brought loneliness. Many of these women had been cast out by families, abandoned by lovers, or sold into the trade when there were no other choices left. The snow outside reminded them of the warmth they no longer had, the hearth of a childhood home, the touch of a mother's hand, the laughter of siblings now far away. Yet within the walls of the brothel, they found a different kind of family. Women who shared bread, who rubbed warmth into frozen hands, who whispered encouragement when despair threatened to swallow them whole. Despite the cruelty around them, these women created rituals of resilience. Some lit tiny candles and kept them burning as symbols of hope, no matter how dark the nights became. Others stitched together scraps of cloth into makeshift quilts, every patch a reminder that survival was possible when pieces were joined together. And through it all, life inside the brothel continued. Clients came, fewer in number, but desperate for warmth themselves. Coins exchanged hands, but for the women, survival was the true currency. Every night endured was proof of their endurance, every morning was another victory against the winter that sought to claim them. Beyond the physical struggle, the winter carried a far heavier weight, the burden of the mind. For many women trapped in these places, the cold season stretched like an endless shadow. Days blurred together, marked only by the bitter frost on the windows and the dim light of tallow candles burning low. Hope was often the first casualty of winter. Some women dreamed of escape. They imagined walking away under the cover of snow, disappearing into the countryside, finding shelter in a monastery or work in a distant village. But reality was cruel. Snowbound roads, watchful brothel keepers, and the constant risk of starvation outside those walls made freedom almost impossible. Their dreams became a form of survival, a world inside their minds that no frost could touch. For others, winter forced them to face their deepest fears. The silence of the night amplified memories of the past, betrayals, abandonment, and the reasons that had brought them to the brothel in the first place. Many drowned those memories with ale or cheap wine, not because it warmed them, but because it dulled the ache of remembering. Yet even in such darkness, there were sparks of resilience. Women whispered stories of saints and miracles, tales passed down through generations. Some believed that winter was a test from God, and surviving it meant they had been chosen for something greater. Whether true or not, these beliefs gave them the strength to endure. Society beyond those wooden doors offered no kindness. Respectable townsfolk often sneered at them, calling them sinners, believing their suffering was deserved. Few cared that these women were often victims of circumstance, poverty, coercion, or betrayal. And so, survival became not just a fight against hunger and cold, but against judgment, shame, and invisibility. Still, within their hidden world, they carved out moments of humanity. They sang quietly to one another, hummed lullabies from their childhoods, or braided each other's hair by candlelight. Small acts of tenderness became lifelines, proof that even in the harshest winters, they were still human, still alive, still capable of care. The deepest irony of medieval winters was found in the streets outside. The same men who cursed these women in the daylight often sought their company when the nights turned unbearable. Wealthy merchants, cloaked in fur, slipped through icy alleys under cover of darkness. Soldiers on leave, priests who preached virtue by day, even noblemen in disguise, all of them sought warmth where they had no right to demand it. The hypocrisy was staggering. In public, these men condemned brothel women as sinners, the very embodiment of temptation and moral decay. But behind closed doors, in rooms dimly lit by firelight, they begged for comfort, for warmth, for a human touch against the cold. The women knew this truth well: they were despised and yet depended upon, rejected and yet essential. For many, this double standard was a source of quiet rage. But survival demanded silence. A woman who spoke out, who dared to accuse or expose a man of influence, risked punishment far harsher than winter itself. So they endured in silence, carrying the weight of society's contradictions on their frail shoulders. Yet, in that silence, they also found power. They learned the art of listening, gathering secrets whispered by drunken nobles, overhearing gossip from merchants, and catching slips of information from soldiers too tired to guard their tongues. Knowledge became a shield, a weapon they wielded carefully. In a world that sought to strip them of everything, information was one thing they could quietly possess. The winters forged in them a strange resilience. Some women began to see themselves not only as survivors, but as keepers of hidden truths. They bore witness to the hypocrisy of a world that judged them while leaning on them for survival. And though their voices were rarely heard in history, their endurance left an imprint, an unspoken testimony to the human will to survive, no matter how cold the night or cruel the world. As the winters pressed harder, survival no longer depended on the coins of passing strangers, it depended on the women themselves. Behind locked doors and shuttered windows, they built a sisterhood no outsider could understand. In a world that gave them little choice, they created their own rules of loyalty, sacrifice, and protection. When one woman fell ill, others shared their scraps of food and tended to her fever. If frostbite blackened the hands of another, the others rubbed warmth back into her fingers, refusing to let her slip into death's grip. They shared clothing, passing around cloaks and scarves, layering themselves with whatever rags could keep out the wind. What little they had was stretched thin, but together it was enough to carry them through the longest nights. This solidarity was not born out of kindness alone, it was necessity. They knew that without each other, they would not survive. A single woman alone against the cold and hunger of medieval winters was doomed. But a group, bound by shared suffering and whispered promises, had a chance. Their companionship became a lifeline. They braided each other's hair, sang quiet songs to drown out the howling winds, and even told jokes when despair threatened to suffocate them. In moments when the world outside labeled them as nothing more than shadows of shame, inside they became mothers, sisters, and friends to one another. And yet, the outside world could never see this hidden strength. Townsfolk spoke of them as sinful, cursed, deserving of misery. They could not imagine that within those cold stone walls, there was love, loyalty, and resilience stronger than any sermon preached in the village church. The women's survival was not just a battle against winter, it was a rebellion against a society that wished them invisible. But as the winter deepened into its cruelest weeks, even sisterhood and hope were tested to the breaking point. Food grew so scarce that some nights the women went to sleep with only a mouthful of thin broth, their stomachs twisting in hunger. Bread turned hard as stone, and meat, when it appeared at all, was often rotten, crawling with frost. The weakest among them wasted away, their bodies too fragile to fight against starvation and cold. The brothel itself became a prison of desperation. Windows rattled with icy winds, roofs leaked snowmelt into their beds, and fires burned low because wood was too expensive. On the coldest nights, the air inside felt no warmer than the frost outside. Every breath came out as a cloud of white, every cough echoed like a reminder of death waiting just beyond the door. Despair began to creep into their minds. Some women whispered of leaving, of slipping into the forests or vanishing into distant towns. But winter roads were merciless. To step outside alone, without coin or shelter, was a gamble most knew would end in death. So they stayed, clinging to survival inside those walls, even when their strength was nearly gone. And yet, in the heart of this misery, their resilience flared brightest. When famine threatened to break them, they scavenged, boiling animal bones until they softened into broth, gathering herbs buried under snow, or trading trinkets for a crust of bread. When one woman collapsed, the others carried her, refusing to let winter claim another sister too soon. The brothel keeper, greedy and cruel, tightened his grip as resources dwindled. Rations were cut, punishments grew harsher, and the women were pushed to exhaustion whenever clients came. Still, they endured. Their survival was not passive, it was a quiet act of defiance, a refusal to surrender to the cruelty of both man and nature. The coldest weeks were a battle of inches. Then, at last, the world began to change. Subtle at first, an extra minute of daylight lingering at the horizon, the drip of snowmelt sliding from the eaves, the faint cry of birds returning after months of silence. The women noticed it before anyone else. For those who had stared death in the face all winter, the smallest signs of spring were miracles. The ice that had sealed wells began to crack, and fresh water flowed again. Merchants slowly returned to the roads, bringing carts of grain, salted fish, and dried fruit. Prices were still cruelly high, but compared to the starvation of midwinter, even the smallest crumbs felt like feasts. Inside the brothels, survival shifted into something else, rebuilding. The women who had endured began mending torn garments, scrubbing soot from the walls, and restuffing straw mattresses. It wasn't comfort they were after, but dignity. Winter had stripped them bare, tested every fiber of their will, and now they were determined to rise again with the season. The alliances they had forged in desperation now blossomed into something stronger. Blacksmiths who had shared the heat of their forges continued to trade small favors. Stable boys who had let them warm themselves among animals brought leftover hay for bedding. Even monks, guilty in their own silence, offered bread more openly once the harshest cold had passed. And something remarkable happened. Clients, many from wealthier households, returned not just for company, but for the knowledge the women had gathered. Whispers spread through the city. If you wanted to know how to keep food from spoiling, how to layer clothes for warmth, or how to fight off frostbite, it was the women of the brothels who held the answers. For the first time, power began to tilt. These women, once dismissed as worthless, suddenly possessed knowledge even the nobility respected. What had started as survival had become influence. But with influence came danger. Authorities who once tolerated these women's hidden networks now feared them. If brothel women could outsmart famine, if they could survive when others perished, what else might they achieve? And so, while spring brought life and color back to the world, it also stirred unease in those who held power. The women had survived the winter. But survival was only the beginning. Spring brought light, food, and warmth, but it also brought something far more dangerous: attention. For months, the women had endured quietly, surviving in the shadows of society. Now, word of their resilience spread beyond the brothel walls. Whispers carried through marketplaces, across taverns, and even into the halls of noble estates. The women of the brothels had survived the famine better than many lords and merchants. At first, people marveled. How had they done it? How could those with nothing endure when others with wealth and status had perished? Curiosity turned to envy, and envy to suspicion. If the most marginalized women could survive when others failed, perhaps they were not victims at all, perhaps they were dangerous. Authorities began to take notice. Tax collectors discovered something unsettling: brothel districts were generating more income in the harshest winters than during the easy months of summer. This was not how medieval society was meant to function. According to the rigid order of things, the poor were supposed to suffer and depend on charity, not outlast those with power. City officials started investigating. They summoned brothel keepers, demanding answers about the women's hidden economies and alliances. Some women were interrogated, accused of hoarding, of illegal trade, even of witchcraft. To survive so well when others had starved seemed unnatural, too clever, too resourceful. But the women were careful. Their secrets weren't written down, their strategies lived in whispers, in shared habits, in unspoken bonds. When questioned, they spoke simply, as if their survival were nothing more than luck. Behind closed doors, however, their networks remained strong, and their knowledge continued to spread. Meanwhile, their influence grew in unexpected ways. Wealthy men began to visit not just for pleasure, but for advice. Some came with questions: how do you keep rooms warm without expensive wood? What herbs can stop a cough before it kills? How can food be stretched to last through shortages? And the women, for the right price, shared what they knew. It was a reversal no one had predicted, knowledge flowing upward, from the most despised women in society to the nobility itself. The brothels had become not just places of vice, but centers of survival wisdom. And while officials tried to suppress this influence, they could not stop it. For once a secret proves its worth, it cannot be contained. But this rising influence came with a cost. Power, once tasted, always draws enemies. The same strategies that had kept these women alive through winter now marked them as a threat to the very foundations of medieval order. And the powerful were not about to let that threat grow unchecked. The whispers could no longer be ignored. As brothel women's reputation for resilience spread, the church and nobility grew restless. In a society built on rigid hierarchy, the idea that women living on the margins had discovered survival techniques superior to lords and priests was intolerable. It wasn't just a curiosity, it was a threat. Priests thundered from pulpits, warning that the women's success was the work of sin, or worse, sorcery. How else could they endure when honorable families froze in their stone halls? To the church, their survival smacked of rebellion against divine order. If suffering was meant to humble the poor, nobles, too, bristled with unease. Some secretly consulted these women, paying for their advice, while others called for punishment. They feared that if survival could be found outside of wealth, land, and bloodlines, then their very authority was in question. How fragile was power if women with no titles, no property, and no protection could outlast them? Accusations soon followed. Women were summoned to city courts under charges of hoarding, black market dealings, or witchcraft. Officials tried to unravel their networks, searching for written records, hidden caches of food, or evidence of secret alliances. But they found almost nothing. These women's strength lay not in parchment or coin but in memory, whispers, and trust. And that secrecy became their shield. What could not be written down could not be confiscated. What lived in minds and hearts could not be erased. The authorities tried to fracture them, but each woman carried only a piece of the whole. One knew how to preserve food, another how to insulate rooms, another where to find allies. Together they formed an invisible web that was impossible to destroy. Still, the threat of persecution was real. Some women were beaten, others imprisoned. A few, in darker corners of Europe, faced trials where their ingenuity was branded as witchcraft. Yet, astonishingly, the networks endured. For every woman lost, another rose to take her place, carrying the knowledge forward. And beneath this growing tension, something extraordinary was happening. Survival knowledge that had begun as a lifeline for the most vulnerable was seeping, drop by drop, into the fabric of medieval society itself. The very nobles and clergy who condemned these women were now quietly imitating their methods, layering clothes, modifying homes, preserving food, and using communal heat strategies once mocked as lowly. The struggle between survival and suppression continued like a tug-of-war across medieval Europe. On one side stood the women, resilient, resourceful, and bound together by invisible threads of trust. On the other side stood the church and nobility, frightened by a knowledge they could neither fully condemn nor fully control. But history has a way of betraying its own hypocrisies. The very strategies that had kept brothel women alive in the darkest winters began quietly reshaping daily life far beyond the walls of their quarters. Merchants, once indifferent to the poor, started copying their preservation techniques. Layered clothing, once seen as crude, became fashionable among townsfolk because it worked better than fur alone. Even noble estates began altering the way they stored food and heated halls, mimicking, in secret, the innovations born in the poorest districts. Communities that had once shunned brothel women now depended, unknowingly, on their legacy. Markets bustled with dried meats and spiced wines that traced their origins back to desperate experiments in cold kitchens. Families adopted communal sleeping habits to survive freezing nights. Herbal remedies that had once passed hand to hand in whispers spread through villages, saving lives one cough, one fever at a time. The women themselves understood this transformation. They knew they could never claim credit openly, doing so meant risk of punishment, humiliation, or worse. But they took pride in the quiet knowledge that their scars had not been endured in vain. Every survival technique that slipped beyond their walls was proof that their suffering had reshaped society itself. And yet, the danger never fully faded. With every harsh winter, new accusations would rise, claims of witchcraft, greed, or sin. Survival itself was treated as rebellion. But rebellion, once whispered, never truly disappears. For the women of the brothels, survival was more than endurance. It was resistance. And though their names rarely made it into chronicles or noble records, their influence lingered in every hearth, every kitchen, every layer of cloth that helped Europe endure the unforgiving winters of the Middle Ages. They were invisible architects of resilience, unacknowledged teachers of survival in a world that sought to erase them. Their story is not one of shame, but of strength. For in the darkest of seasons, when death walked the streets and hunger hollowed the bones of the mighty, it was the forgotten women who taught humanity how to live. So what do we learn from these women, hidden in the shadows of medieval history? That survival was never about wealth, titles, or even brute strength. It was about ingenuity, resilience, and the unbreakable bond of community. When nobles rationed bread and peasants starved in their huts, it was the women of the brothels, those dismissed as outcasts and sinners, who discovered ways to cheat the cold. They layered cloth into invisible insulation. They transformed scraps into feasts. They built networks of trade, information, and care that rivaled the sophistication of kingdoms. They turned their bodies not only into tools of survival, but into weapons against despair. And though history tried to bury them beneath shame, their legacy seeped into the bones of Europe itself. The way we heat our homes, preserve our food, and share resources in crisis, all echo, in some small way, the strategies born in those frozen, dimly lit rooms. The irony is staggering. The very women society sought to silence became silent teachers, shaping survival across centuries. Their names are gone, their faces forgotten, but their impact is alive every winter, when humans gather by fire, share food in scarcity, or cling together for warmth. So the next time you imagine the Middle Ages, the lords in their castles, the monks in their cloisters, the merchants in their markets, remember also the women at the margins. For when the world grew coldest, when the nights were longest and the frost cut deepest, it was they who kept the spark of life alive. They were not just survivors. They were innovators. They were guardians of resilience. And without them, the story of medieval Europe might have been far shorter, and far darker. But let us linger a moment longer in those shadowed streets, where frost glittered on broken cobblestones and the lantern light trembled in the dark. Picture the brothel doors creaking open on a bitter night. Women wrapped in layers of patched wool step out cautiously, the cold air biting their cheeks. They barter with traveling merchants, exchanging whispers for fuel, secrets for bread, favors for salted fish. The street is alive with a strange commerce, half survival, half defiance. Inside, the hearth glows low but steady. Women sit shoulder to shoulder, sewing torn garments into makeshift blankets. Their voices rise in quiet song, half prayer, half lullaby, drowning the groan of the winter wind. There is laughter too, fragile but real, a reminder that even in hardship, joy found a way to breathe. Some nights, when the snowstorm howled too fiercely, they told stories. Tales of saints, of queens, of goddesses long forgotten. In those stories, they were no longer trapped by walls or judged by men, they were heroines, warriors, keepers of hidden wisdom. Around the fire, imagination became another form of survival. And as centuries turned, their unrecorded traditions seeped into culture. A recipe preserved here, a herbal cure carried there, a method of heating reused in village homes. Their knowledge spread like sparks on the wind, anonymous, unclaimed, but enduring. Historians may not have carved their names into stone, but if survival itself could write, their story would be written across every frost-covered window, every hearth fire, every hand that reaches for warmth in the dead of winter. Because survival, after all, is not only about living through a season, it's about leaving behind the strength for others to endure. The harshest of winters always ended, though it never felt that way while the storms raged. And when the thaw finally came, it revealed not only the scars of cold but also the quiet triumphs of survival. Imagine the streets of a medieval town in early spring. The snow, once piled against crooked timber houses, has melted into muddy rivulets. The air is still sharp, but the frost has loosened its grip. Markets stir back to life. Bells echo faintly from a distant church tower. And there, tucked in the shadows of winding alleys, the brothel doors open again, not with desperation now, but with relief. Inside, women stretch stiff limbs, shaking off the long weight of winter. Some hang their patched blankets to dry in the pale sunlight. Others sweep out ash and soot from the hearths that had burned endlessly through the cold months. Their survival had not been graceful, it had been messy, weary, stitched together with scraps and willpower. But it had worked. There is no applause, no recognition from the townsfolk who pass by with baskets of fresh bread and fish. These women remain invisible, their contribution erased by silence. And yet, within their walls, they know the truth, they had endured what many could not. Survival, for them, was victory enough. And so the cycle turned. Another season, another year. Winters would come again, as cruel as ever, but they now carried with them a memory, a map of endurance, that would guide them through the next storm. Perhaps history forgot their names. Perhaps their graves have crumbled into dust. But the echoes of their endurance live on in the simplest of human instincts, to gather, to share, to protect, to hold on to warmth until the world softens once more. And so, when we look back at medieval winters, let us not only remember kings in their castles or monks in their cloisters. Let us also remember the women in the brothels, the silent keepers of survival, who turned cold nights into lessons of resilience, and whose strength lingers still, like embers glowing quietly beneath the ash. And so, the story drifts into silence, carried on the fading winds of medieval winter. The brothels, the narrow streets, the women who huddled around the fire, all of it now belongs to the echoes of time. Yet, as we step back from those frost-bitten nights, their struggle continues to whisper across centuries. Because survival is not locked in the Middle Ages. It is not a relic of history. It is a truth as human as breath itself. Even today, in a world lit by electricity and warmed by technology, people still fight their own winters, whether storms of poverty, loneliness, injustice, or despair. And perhaps, without knowing, we carry pieces of their wisdom. Every time a family sits close in the cold, every time neighbors share food when resources run thin, every time someone laughs through hardship to keep spirits alive, we are echoing the resilience of those forgotten women. The world may have turned its eyes away from them, branding them with shame, erasing their worth. But history has a way of keeping secrets alive. It hides them in traditions, in habits, in the quiet ways people endure. And when we look closely, we realize that those women were not merely surviving winters in forgotten brothels. They were writing lessons of endurance into the human spirit itself. So as the snow melts and dawn rises on this story, we are left with a choice. We can let them remain invisible, lost in the margins of history. Or we can honor them, not as shadows of shame, but as teachers of survival, resilience, and strength. The snow fades. The fires burn low. The sound of laughter and whispered stories lingers only in memory. We step out of that world of timber walls and icy winds and back into our own age, a place where winters may not be as deadly, but where survival still carries the same weight. Think for a moment, how often do we walk past the invisible, those whose struggles we never see? How often do we dismiss the resilience of people living at the margins, people whose resourcefulness may one day hold lessons for us all? The women of medieval brothels lived in a time when survival was not guaranteed. They endured judgment, poverty, and the brutal bite of winter with nothing but wit, scraps of food, layers of cloth, and the strength they found in one another. They were not saints, not nobles, not celebrated figures, but perhaps that is what makes their story matter most. Because survival is not about perfection. It is about persistence. And maybe that is why their memory still matters. Because hidden in their story is a reminder for us all, when life turns cold, when the world feels merciless, survival comes not from isolation, but from community, courage, and creativity. So tonight, as you sit in your own home, warmed by the comfort they could only dream of, remember them. Remember the women who taught humanity how to outlast the storm, not with swords or crowns, but with fire, laughter, and one another. Their names may be forgotten, but their strength belongs to all of us. And in the end, that is how they truly survived. The camera lingers on a medieval street at dawn. A pale sun creeps over crooked rooftops, its light soft and uncertain, melting the last patches of snow. Smoke drifts slowly from chimneys, curling into the frozen sky. The marketplace stirs awake, footsteps splashing in thawed mud. And then, almost hidden in the shadows, you see it. A door creaks open. One of the women steps outside, wrapped in layers of patched wool, her breath misting in the morning air. She squints at the rising sun. For a moment, her face carries something rare, relief. Not joy, not triumph, but the simple relief of knowing she has survived another winter. Behind her, faint laughter drifts from within the brothel, tired but alive. The warmth of the fire still glows faintly through a cracked shutter. Inside those walls, women are sweeping floors, shaking out blankets, boiling water for the first proper meal in months. Their hands are rough, their faces pale, but their spirits, unbroken. The camera pulls back slowly. The street grows smaller, the rooftops blur, until the entire town becomes just a dot on the horizon. The sound of the wind fades. And with it, the women vanish into history once again, anonymous, forgotten, but not gone. Because their story is not carved into stone or written in grand chronicles. It is written in the quiet art of survival, carried forward in every generation that learns how to endure. And as the last frame darkens, a single truth remains. The cold may have been merciless, but their fire burned longer. As the scene fades, history seems to close its doors. The cobblestones grow silent, the echoes of laughter dissolve into the cold air, and the fires that once kept them alive flicker into darkness. But stories do not truly end. They linger, like breath on a winter morning, fading but never forgotten. The women who survived those brutal winters in hidden corners of medieval towns left no monuments, no chronicles, no statues in their honor. And yet, in a way, for survival itself is a legacy. Each act of persistence, every scrap of food saved, every blanket stitched, every fire kept alive, was not just for themselves, but for the generations who would come after. Their resilience became part of the human fabric, a thread woven so deeply into history that we live with it still, even if we don't always recognize it. And so, as we step away from the frost and shadows of the Middle Ages, one truth follows us. That the greatest lessons of history are often taught not by kings or queens, but by those who lived in silence, those who fought not for glory, but simply to see another dawn. Their names may never be known, but their spirit remains. And in remembering them, we keep their fire alive. And so the winters passed, year after year, century after century. Each generation of women inherited the knowledge of the last. A trick for layering cloth. A method of preserving grain. A way of bargaining when coin was scarce. The wisdom moved quietly, passed not in books or records, but in whispers, in gestures, in the simple acts of living. This was their true legacy, not survival for a single season, but survival as a tradition. A knowledge so practical, so necessary, that it outlived the walls of the brothels themselves. Even when the towns changed, when laws shifted, when old streets were torn down and rebuilt, the memory of how to endure harsh winters remained. And perhaps that is why, even now, their presence still lingers. Every time we light a fire in the cold, every time we gather close to share warmth, every time we face a storm not with despair but with determination, we are echoing their spirit. The brothel women of the medieval world may never have sought to leave a mark on history. Yet, in surviving the winters that killed so many, they did exactly that. Their mark is not carved in stone, it is carried in us. And as we close the pages of their story, one lesson remains clear. That strength is not always loud. That survival is not always celebrated. But it is always remembered, whether by history, or by the generations who inherit its quiet fire. The snow may fall. The nights may lengthen. But their resilience burns still, a flame against the darkness. As the world outside froze in silence, these women lit fires not just of wood, but of resilience. In every shared cloak, every bowl of broth, every secret passed from one generation to the next, they carried with them the warmth of survival. They were women society tried to forget. Yet, in the deadliest winters, when even the powerful bent under the cold, they endured. Not through wealth, not through status, but through unity, courage, and the quiet genius of survival. And so, their story remains, a flame that refuses to die. Proof that even in the harshest winters, the human spirit burns brightest in those who were given the least, but fought with everything they had.